everyone, welcome back to my channel, or welcome to my channel if you're new. My name is Kristen, this is my booktube, and in today's video we are going to be going over all of the books that I read in the month of March. There are 4 books in this March wrap-up video that we will be talking about today, and before we hop into that, we're going to talk just a little bit about the stats that I get from StoryGraph for this month of reading. So first up, we have the moods of the books that I read. The biggest mood being mysterious, followed by dark and tense, and the bottom 2 being sad and challenging. As far as the pace of the books that I read in the month of March, 75% of them were medium-paced books, and then 25% were fast-paced. All 4 of the books that I read this month were audiobooks, and 75% of them were between 8 hours and 15 hours and 59 minutes. And that's like the medium length category for audiobooks, I believe, in StoryGraph. And then 25% were under 8 hours. So for the genres of the books that I read this month, we had 3 counted under the mystery category, 2 under the thriller category, 1 in the classics category, 1 in historical, 1 in crime, and 1 in contemporary. In total, I listened to 43.95 hours worth of audiobooks in March. And then the average star rating across all 4 books was a 3.88. So fairly decent, but that 5-star one is definitely doing some heavy lifting this month. So we'll go ahead and jump on into talking about the 4 books that I finished in March. And technically the first book that I finished in March was Dumb Witness by Agatha Christie, but I already talked about that book in my last wrap-up video, just because that was a February rollover that I finished within like the first couple days of March. So I included it in that wrap up. I did enjoy that Agatha Christie book, and I talk a lot more about why I feel the way that I feel about it in that video. So I do recommend it. And if you want to know specific reasons, you can just go watch that video after this one and find out my exact thoughts. So after Dumb Witness, the next book that I read in March was Listen for the Lie. And this is one that I had seen a lot of places. I believe it was a book of the month book pick for some month in 2024. I think that there were a couple people in my work book club that have read it that were talking about it as well. So I had heard a little bit of buzz around this book going into it. And I did end up rating it 3 stars. I just was not super impressed with it. So the premise of the book is that 5 years ago, our main character and her best friend were at a wedding, and by the end of the night, the best friend ended up dead, and the main character was found wandering a country road in small town Texas, covered in her best friend's blood, having absolutely no memory of what happened to her or her friend. And as you can imagine, a lot of people assume that she is lying about not remembering and that she killed her best friend in a fit of rage, and that the lost memory is just her covering for that. So after that happens, 5 years later, a true crime podcast called Listen for the Lie decides to pick up the case and try and figure out if they can definitively say what happened the night of the wedding. And then we get a couple of different points of view. We get the main character's point of view, her inner monologue, all of that. Then we have interdispersed clips from the podcast itself, which was kind of interesting in the audiobook because they played like theme music and everything. They had, I believe, a couple different voice actors for the different people in the town. And I'm kind of torn on how I feel about that. I didn't really completely love it. I do think it's a cool idea. I just don't really know if I really liked it in this book specifically, if that makes sense. But I see what they were going for with it. The whole time in this book, the main character has this voice in the back of her head that is basically telling her to kill people, which, like, if she's trying to say that, like, she didn't kill her best friend, giving her an inner monologue of the voice in the back of her head talking about killing people and her like actually visualizing killing people, not a good way to get me to believe in her, honestly, to get me on her side. Cause like, that's a little unhinged, I believe. I at least have never been talking to someone, even if they are making me so angry, never have I once like just thought about being violent, you know, thought about bashing their head in with an object nearby. But that's what this main character does with pretty much everyone she's talking to in this book. even like relatives she has these same thoughts about. And I really didn't enjoy that part, to be quite honest. It really put me off of liking the main character much at all. She already has like a bristly personality, so that on top of her seemingly fighting this compulsion to murder people is not a good mix to get me to start rooting for her. So I didn't really like the main character a lot in this book, and I think because of that, I was a lot less invested in the story. So I think me not being super invested in the story, coupled with me not really wanting to root for the main character, had me disinterested enough to where it just wasn't really that thrilling of a read for me. So overall, I thought it was an okay book, but this is definitely one that I can see myself just completely forgetting about the second that I'm done recording this video. So truly, it is just kind of mid, in my opinion. The next book that I finished in March was The Paris Apartment by Lucy Foley. This one I ended up rating a 3.5. As you would expect, it has to do with this Paris apartment. Our main character is from London, and her older half-brother has this apartment in Paris, and she gets into a bit of legal trouble, it seems, back in the UK. And she ends up basically booking a one-way Eurostar ticket to Paris and tells her brother a couple hours before she shows up that she's coming over and she's gonna stay for a bit. And her brother's kind of, taken aback, as I feel you would be if your sibling just called you and was like, hey, I'll be there in 3 hours and I'm gonna stay for a while. I feel like you would want a little bit more of a heads up than that. But anyways, he's not gonna turn her away. It's his little sister and he does care for her. So he says, okay, fine, I will get everything ready. I'll let you in, like all of that logistical stuff that you got to get through if you're meeting up with someone like that. So Jess, our main character, arrives in Paris and she makes her way to her brother's apartment. Meanwhile, she is messaging him and he's not really responding, but she has his voice note with the directions to the apartment, so she follows that and ends up at the gates where she doesn't know the code to get in. So she is trying to get a hold of her brother, it's not working, and then she sees someone else go through the gate and takes note of the code that they use to get in. And just like that, she is in the apartment complex. And then once she is inside the complex, she makes her way to her brother's apartment and she realizes that her brother is completely missing. And he knew that she was coming, so she at first thinks that maybe he just popped out to go to the grocery store real quick, something like that. But then as time passes, she realizes that he is just completely missing. So she launches off on her little investigation to try to figure out what happened to her brother. And there is a cast of characters that lives within this apartment complex that all seem quite suspicious for varying reasons. And Jess quickly realizes that there is probably a darker reason why her brother just completely disappeared. So I thought this one was okay. I wasn't really gripped by the story. I feel like the pacing was a little bit weird in the way that stuff was revealed. I feel like one of the biggest bombshells, or at least what I think they intended to be one of the bigger bombshells, was revealed quite early on in the book. And then once that was revealed, it just felt kind of drug out from there, to me at least. And I think that was the biggest thing for me. The pacing just felt a little bit off in the way that the events happened and the way that things were revealed. And I think that because of that, it just wasn't as exciting as other Lucy Foley books have been for me in the past. And this does kind of tie in with another book that I did start in March, but I technically finished like the first day of April, because I remember liking The Guest List by Lucy Foley far more than I enjoyed this book. Because it's been a couple years since I read The Guest List, I also went back and did a reread of The Guest List after I finished this book. And I do think that the pacing of that story and the events that are revealed is better than the pacing in the Paris Apartments. So I ended up giving The Guest List 4 stars. And because I still liked the story in the Paris Apartment overall, I just think the pacing was a little bit weird. I gave that one a 3.5 because I thought it was a little bit better than purely average, but it's definitely not going to be the Lucy Foley book that I recommend to other people. That one still goes to the guest list, in my opinion. So the last book that I'm going to talk about in this March wrap-up video is The Women by Kristen Hanna. And this was our workbook club's pick for the month of March. And this is one that I have talked about reading before, but I did not actually ever get around to reading. So this month, since it was my workbook club's pick, I did finally read it and I did really enjoy it. This is the one that I rated 5 stars. I thought the story was so good. Kristen Hanna did a great job with the historical fiction of the Vietnam War. And even though the plot points at some points got under my skin and certain events in the book really got me frustrated, it was still an amazing book and she wrapped it up so well in the end, and I really, really enjoyed it a lot. And to be quite honest, because I've got to be real about it, I did also cry like a little baby at the end of this one as well. I got to the last like 30 minutes of the audiobook and I was like, oh wow, I don't think I'm gonna cry at this one. You know, I got a little emotional, I got a little teary-eyed when certain characters like either had something horrible happen to them or they passed away. You know, I had moments where I got close to crying, but I had not at that point shed a tear. 15 and a half hours into this book, I had not shed a tear yet. And I, silly me, was like, we're good. I'm good. I'm not going to cry in this book. A new phenomenon for Kristen Hanna books for me, honestly. And then, the last 30 minutes of the book, she wraps it up beautifully. She ties the pretty little bow, and then boom, I'm crying. It's one of those where I'm not even like, you know, shoulder racking kind of sobs. It's where I'm just sitting there and I'm like slack jawed and tears are just rolling down my face. You know, it's that kind of crying. She did it in The Nightingale and she done did it again in this one for me personally. I really couldn't give it anything else than 5 stars because it had me feeling a whole range of emotions throughout the whole thing. And I really did love the book. I had such a strong affinity for the main character, and I think that's also why I got so frustrated at certain points in the book, because I just wanted her to make different decisions and I was just so invested in her as a character that I was getting so upset with everything happening to her and the way that things were going that I had to distance myself from the book for a while. And if that doesn't say that you're invested in a story, I don't know what else does, because I literally had to pause it at certain points and be like, okay, I can't deal with Frankie right now. I need a break. And I will come back when I am ready to listen to more of her story because I'm just not emotionally here for it right now. So yeah, I am so glad that we picked this book for my workbook club. I'm so happy that I finally read it and it's not on my TBR anymore. And now I guess I need to read The Four Winds because that's the other Kristen Hanna book that I own. I got The Nightingale right there. I've already read her. Now I've read The Women and I don't even own that. So Four Winds. I gotta squeeze that one in somewhere. I didn't even really explain what the plot of The Women is. So for those that don't know, The Women is a historical fiction about the Vietnam War. It basically spans from, I believe, like 1966 to 1982. And it follows the main character whose name is Frankie McGrath. And it follows her as she follows in the footsteps of her brother and enlists as a nurse in the army for the Vietnam War. It follows her throughout her 2 tours, when she comes back home and how she is received as a veteran. It deals with different historical topics like the Vietnam War protests and how American propaganda was not the most transparent about what was going on. And it also covers things like PTSD in soldiers and the nurses that served in the Vietnam War. And there is so much that goes on in this book. And one of my coworkers puts it really well because she always says that Kristen Hanna does historical fiction in a way where pretty much every notable thing that could have happened during that time period happens to her main characters. So it's just a lot happening to one person in pretty much all of her stories, and this one is no different. So much happens to Frankie. She goes through so much in those 16 years that the book spans. And I just love the way that Kristen Hanna writes in general. I think she has a beautiful way of describing things in such detail. And I also really love the way that she weaves in little historical Easter eggs throughout the books. Like, for example, since this one takes place from the 60s to the 80s, there's a lot of stuff that's going on at the exact same time as the events of this book. So things will be happening, and then they will talk about how, you know, the news is on in the background and they're talking about the breaking of Watergate or something like that, or the kind of music that they were listening to at the time. And it just helps to make it a bit more immersive, and it helps the reader when thinking back to the period of the Vietnam War and the years after to remind them that, you know, songs and movies and TV shows that we may think of a little bit differently today have roots that reach back to war protests and war propaganda and stuff like that. So with that, that is the end of my March wrap-up video, or at least the books that I read in March. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, go ahead and leave a like down below. Let me know. You should also subscribe while you're down there because I put out new videos pretty much every single weekend. And yeah, I'm thinking of doing another Hunger Games reading vlog for when I read Sunrise on the Reaping, so I can really document my descent into madness with that book. So you might have that to look forward to soon. I'm thinking I'm gonna go back and read The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes first, and then make my way through the rest of the series. So if the next time you see me talking about the Hunger Games, I'm starting with The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, you know why. I gotta start from the beginning so that I can have that context going into reading Sunrise on the Reaping, okay? So that's what we're gonna do. So you'll have that to look forward to soon, hopefully. I hope you guys are having a wonderful day wherever you are in the world, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!